Good morning, welcome back everyone. Welcome to the first session of the IBioIC Annual Conference 2021, which is focusing on how biotechnology can help address climate challenges. And this topic is close to my heart, having spent most of my career working in industrial biotechnology and having previously co-authored the National IB Strategy to 2030, which firmly centres around the benefits of industrial biotech and the opportunity to make a major contribution to a sustainable circular economy where waste is close to zero. In terms of climate change, industrial biotechnology is a key enabler of decarbonisation and the driving force for a strong and vibrant bioeconomy. Its transformative enabling technologies have the potential to change our relationship with the resources we use and to develop inspiring solutions that improve our lives. IB can reroute our unsustainable extraction, manufacture and consumption, and the opportunities are endless. Indeed, this is at the core of the National Horizon Centre's purpose, where I'm currently director. As a UK Centre of Excellence for the bioindustry, the National Horizon Centre has a core focus on biomanufacturing and bioprocessing. And being situated in the Tees Valley, which hosts one of 6 industrial clusters that are responsible for producing over 40,000 tonnes of CO2 a year, is even more important. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Tees Valley, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner was supposedly based on the former ICI plant at the heart of the region, which was born from an economy based primarily on heavy industry, notably steel and petrochemicals. However, today biotech has been well established in the Tees Valley, born from the region's historical links to fermentation technology and innovation. This green revolution, however, has evolved organically over many years, along with the seemingly continual conversations about climate change, with not enough action being taken to halt climbing global temperatures. But all is not lost. The recent pandemic and the race to find a COVID vaccine has shown us that if we need to find a solution, then we can find it. When money is not an obstacle and time is of the essence, we can find solutions in record-breaking times. So if we nationally and globally have the impetus to tackle climate change, then we can, and collaboration is the key. So in this session, you'll be hearing from leading experts in the area of climate change and hearing their views on the role that biotechnology can play in the race to halt global warming. So there'll be time at the end of the 3 talks to ask questions to the panel, and I'd appreciate it if you post any questions in the chat function. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, who's Lord Deben, Chair of the Committee of Climate Change.
Well, thank you very much, and I very much welcome the opportunity of speaking at this very important conference. The truth is that climate change is the biggest physical threat to our society that we have. It doesn't have a vaccine. It's something that we have allowed to get out of all control, and therefore we don't have any kind of control on our timing. So when people say to me, wouldn't it be easier if we took a little longer over the battle to reach net zero? I have to say the timing isn't in our hands. We have by 2050 to do what the law now says we will do, which is to reduce our emissions to net zero. And that's a very, very tough task. But it is not in any way impossible. As Jen has just said so clearly, it isn't at all impossible, but it will need very, very considerable concentration and very, very considerably harder work than we've done up to now. I want to make that distinction very clear. There are those who want us to promise to do net zero by 2030. You can't do that. The transition does take time because of how far down the road towards seriously damaging our planet we have gone. But we don't have any more time than the absolute necessity. And that's why we have to get on with it. If my criticism of government is sometimes sharp, it's centered around that one thing, which is that we have not done what we ought to have done quickly enough. And therefore, what we have to do now has to be done more quickly and in a greater difficulty than if only we had started earlier as many of us have been pressing for years. But we do have a government, both in Westminster and in Edinburgh and elsewhere in the United Kingdom. We do have governments that are committed now to solve these problems. And I think it is very important to point to the remarkable opportunity that we have, which is that this year we host COP26, we host it in Scotland, and we are able therefore to dramatize what can be done, because we're also going to have to dramatize what has to be done. It's COP26's job to move forward from the absolutely iconic occasion of Paris 5 years ago. Because in Paris, we really did change the world. The first time that every nation on earth signed up to fight to keep something which we desperately need to keep, which is the stability of our planet. Oh, we've signed up odd different groups for all kinds of associations through the years, but this is the first universal decision that we need to keep something together because it's a global issue and we have to have a global answer. And the global answer is that we have to keep the rise in temperature below 2 degrees and fight to get it down to 1.5. Of course, that already makes a huge amount of difference. It's already more difficult because we're not arguing this, fighting for these changes for the next generation. We're doing it for ourselves because climate change is already having a huge effect upon the world in which we live. And as I look out over 4 inches of snow here in Suffolk, remind myself of just how different the climate has become in this country during my lifetime. Spring comes very much earlier. Indeed, it comes 17 days earlier from what it was when I first started to work. And that's only one sign. The additional and increasing number of extreme events, the way in which all over the world people are finding it more difficult to live because the climate upon which they rely has changed so much. So what we have to do is to crank up our expectations and our commitments. That's what's going to happen in COP26. And we're very fortunate because there have been significant changes which makes it possible to believe that we really can achieve in COP26 what we need to. The election of Joe Biden means that America has rejoined the world and that we can expect from America the same support for net zero as we are having throughout the industrialized world. And remember, we also have from China, 10 years later than the rest, and I hope we'll be able to bring her to 2050, but still she is seeking to do precisely what the rest of us are doing, because even China, with all the protection she has from reality, which any totalitarian regime has, even China has understood very, very clearly just what a threat climate change can be. And into that, biotechnology has an enormous role to play. We are going to have to reuse and recycle, but we are also going to have to recognize that there will be residues which will need to be used again. Biotechnology is crucial to that. Biotechnology will have some real role to play in the new processes which we will need in order to get to net zero. CCS, carbon capture, storage and usage, depends very significantly on the work of biotechnology. Electricity, hydrogen, industrial heat and jet fuel, all these are going to look to the work that is being done and is being done in this country to ensure that we have the tools to begin to live in a more sensible way. And I very much appreciate the fact that you have chosen the issue of climate as to be the theme of your conference, because we're going to look to those in the biotechnology industry very directly to give us some of the tools which we need to win this battle. It is very dangerous to rely too much on technological innovation. Dangerous because politicians in particular tend to long for a silver bullet. If only we had hydrogen, if only we could do things in this or that way. Well, hydrogen may well be a very important component of our future. Biotechnology in the much wider sense, I'm sure, will be a very important contributor. But in the meantime, we have to do a lot of other things. Hoping for technological change is no substitute for making the vast number of changes we need to make in the way we live in order to be able to live safely in the planet which we didn't create, but which has been given to us. So I'm very clear in the role I think you all have. It is a role within the context of a society which bends all efforts to ensure that we lead the world and ensure that the world comes too, because this global problem can only be solved by us all together. And the tools which you will help to create and give, although they are not silver bullets, they are the means of making possible and financially possible what might otherwise appear to be impossible. And that's why I would end with what Jen said herself. We are fighting coronavirus, and in a single short year, we created a whole range of means by which we could vaccinate people. No one really believed that we could do it as quickly as that. Doesn't mean to say that we don't have to take an awful lot of other methods and do a great deal else as well to fight this battle. With climate change, there is no vaccine, but there are very many things which we can do to hasten along that path to net zero. And biotechnology will play a major part in the changes we have to make.
Great, many thanks, Lord Deben. What a great start to the session. And just a reminder, if anyone can please post any questions, that would be great. So thank you very much. So now we're going to hear from Terry Ahern, who's the CEO of the Scottish Environment Protection Agency.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I want to pick up on a couple of comments that have been made in the first part of the session. Lord Deben, you just talked about we don't have time. So we have very little time left to solve these problems. Jennifer, in your introduction, you talked about the collaboration is the key. So what does a regulator have to offer in this field? And I do actually want to use my 10 minutes to make an offer. So from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, or SEPA, I have an offer to your sector, your profession, your field of endeavour. And it's based on turning around what a regulator is for. So when ministers or governments or parliaments create a regulator, they are creating a set of public officials who can interfere in people's lives. That's not something that politicians do very readily. They do it when there's a good reason and a need. And essentially the need is bad stuff's happening and you need someone to do something about it. So if you look back at the history of health and safety, it's a very blunt way to say it, but too many workers were being injured or killed, so you needed a health and safety regulator. The history of environment agencies or EPAs is toxic pollution in rivers, terrible air quality, waste out of control, so you set up a regulator. If you take the point about we don't have much time left, So if we get to the end of this decade and we haven't made serious inroads into decarbonising, dematerialising our economies and societies, then time will be up. And quite seriously for our species, it'll be up. So a regulator needs no longer just to stop bad stuff. We need to do that. Here in Scotland, many of you will be aware we have issues such as the unnecessary flaring that happens at the ExxonMobil site at Mossmoran. That's an example of the traditional stuff as places like SEPA were set up for, and we put a huge effort into that. We have to get them to stop doing that traditional sort of pollution impact. But that's not enough anymore. What we have to do is help businesses like that, and it sounds a bit strange in terms of business like that, decarbonise, dematerialise. We have to make the energy transition. And that means as a regulator, we have to shift from being satisfied with just achieving compliance outcomes. So in our One Planet Prosperity strategy, we are very clear we will get everyone to compliance. But if we get everyone to compliance, which is what a regulator tends to judge itself on, that will be nowhere near enough, because that won't get us anywhere near decarbonising and dematerialising, and not quickly enough. So I wrote a statement last night for something we're working on, and it went along the lines, something like this, that the goal of a set of regulators getting together on a project in Scotland, I can't remember the exact words, but it was something such as, at its worst, regulation doesn't even solve compliance problems. Like when regulation's operating badly, it doesn't solve compliance problems, and it certainly doesn't help with innovation and transformation. It usually gets in the way. At its very best, and this is what we need from regulators in this decade, we have to quickly solve compliance problems so compliance becomes yesterday's issues. You know, for goodness sake, if we've got a decade to really make these big inroads, then we can't be spending it struggling to get people to compliance. We have to get people to compliance quickly. That becomes yesterday's issue. And what we focus on is not just not getting in the way of innovation, the sort of innovation that you're talking about at this conference, we become a very active driver, supporter, partner of it. So my offer is from SEPA that we will make that transition, and we are making it. And I just want to give a few examples. We have, what we tend to regulate is the sites. So if you take the whiskey industry, it's our top performing industry in terms of compliance. Last ratings were 94%. We'll get them to that 100%. They're very determined about it. They've set a beyond compliance strategy for themselves. Their trade association, the Scotch Whisky Association, launched it a couple of weeks ago. It sets ambitious targets for reducing carbon, reducing waste, reducing water beyond what the law requires, and not just at its sites that we regulate, but through its supply chains. That sort of ambition is what SEPA is here to support. And if I give you a hypothetical example, it's not hypothetical, but it's commercial in confidence, so I can't reveal who it is. But what we tend to get is businesses coming to us now and saying, look, we think our waste stream could become the feedstock for an industry as part of the food and sector a field in Scotland. We can just sit back and say, well, that would be good. But what we actually do is when we regulate sites in 34 sectors, we are effectively regulating supply chains and value chains to unlock a lot of the innovation, and including the sort of things you're talking about at this conference. One thing that has to happen is you have to be able to share risk and return through supply chains and value chains, because sometimes the costs of an innovation in a supply chain will fall largely to one set of businesses, and sometimes the revenue will fall to another set. Sometimes the risks are very split along the supply chain. We have the ability to work on that. So for example, barley growers, whiskey distillers up in the north of Scotland, certainly where the distillers are, suffer from droughts. As an Australian, I find it a bit strange to understand when I first came here that Scotland does have droughts, but we do. And that water shortage is a threat to the environment, but it's also a threat to the economics of those two sectors. While they're in the same supply chain, we regulate them both. In our new way of regulating, how do we help them work together to reduce water use in ways that means they can produce the quality of product, one as an input to the other, and then the whiskey industry as the product they then sell into the consumer market? How do we partner with them and help them in that supply chain arrangement unlock the sort of innovation that will tackle these really significant issues? The other example, and I just want to finish on this one, is our placemaking set of initiatives. So we have 6 placemaking trials. Placemaking is becoming a bit of a buzzword. Things tend to become a buzzwords because they're meaningless cliches or because they actually mean something worthwhile, and I think placemaking does. And so in the leaving catchment, we have 14 partners signed up to one of our voluntary sustainable growth agreements, everyone from private businesses like Diageo through to the local council, Fife Council, Keep Scotland Beautiful, the Coal Authority. And what we have there, we started with our job was looking after water quality. What we really have is 15 partners working with the community on how do we decarbonise, dematerialise this part of Scotland. And when we launched that Sustainable Growth Agreement, I said on STV News that this was one of the heartlands of the original high carbon industrial revolution, which created so much of our prosperity. We didn't understand what the impact of that carbon would be back then. Wouldn't it be sensational if this could be one of the heartlands of the next low carbon industrial revolution? And that's the sort of thing we're working on with a whole group of partners over there. Now, when you have ideas from your sector, the offer is there from SEPA. Don't come and talk to us about, look, here's SEPA's standards that the standards that we administer on behalf of the Parliament. Here's SEPA's processes. Forget our processes, forget the law. Don't worry about that. We'll come back to the law if we need to. But come and say, we've got an idea. We've got an idea how to decarbonise. We've got an idea about how to dematerialise. And talk to us about, is there a role we can play with our various work in supply chains, with our various placemaking initiatives? Because I'm making an offer to you and you need to come and say, SEPA, you've made this offer. Well, we've got something that we want to partner with you on. The worst we can say is we don't think we can help, or it's not for us at this time. But the offer's there, and we really need, I think, to take up what Jennifer said about collaboration needs to be the key, and collaboration in a new way for organisations such as mine. So I hope that's a useful contribution to the conference, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
Thanks, Terry again. Again, another great talk, and please do keep posting your questions. So last but not least, can I introduce Mercedes Maroto-Valer, who's the UK champion for the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre.
Thanks very much. I hope you can hear me. So I'm going to go through a couple of slides. And first, I want to start by saying thank you very much for inviting me today. I think it's a real pleasure to be here, but also following on the previous 2 presentations, it makes really a lot of sense what I want to share with you now. We heard about really setting the scene from Lord Deben about climate change, why it's important. Quite rightly say we don't have a vaccine for climate change. And also I think in terms from Terry about the need to actually work together, as Jen already said as well, collaboration and innovation are going to be key. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So these are graphs probably many of you are familiar with. In my presentation, what I want to focus is on the role of biotechnology for decarbonizing industrial sectors. And kind of a couple of points looking at those graphs. Many of you probably know the manufacturing sector and construction sector. Roughly, they contribute around 12% to the CO2 emissions. But if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, what that graph is telling us is actually, not unexpectedly, is quite a bit of a concentration of where these CO2 emissions are coming from. And in fact, those industrial clusters that you have in there, those areas of highest concentration, we are looking in the order of close to 50% of the total manufacturing and construction sector emissions. So this is really quite important because then when we look in terms of the options, we look at the race and the pace at which we have to deploy technologies. It gives us an indication as well of where we are going to be key points that we need to start considering. And the graph on the right-hand side really brings that point of the urgency, if you want. It is true that the targets are for 2050, 2045 for Scotland, with some intermediate targets as well before then. But I think what is really clear is that the 2020s and into the early 2030s are going to be really key in terms of actually deploying the technologies that we need to be able to achieve our net zero targets. So it's this message of urgency, it's this message of pace that I think we heard already in the previous presentations. And the graph on the right-hand side as well illustrates a point that Lord Deben mentioned as well, that there is no silver bullet. I think probably I would say is that we have a lot of silver bullets. And I think what we need to do is really make sure that we develop and deploy them at the rate and the potential that they have. And one final point in that slide is policy. Technologies cannot be considered in isolation. We need to make sure we have policy, as Terry mentioned. We need to make sure that we have business models. And also what is critical is that we actually, all these help us to drive reductions of emissions, not driving manufacturing overseas. We want to make sure that we prevent carbon leakage. We want to make sure that those clusters that you have on the left-hand side, they actually attract inward investment and we protect the jobs. Those clusters right now probably are in the order of 1.5 million jobs. We move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So some of you may be familiar with this. What are the challenges that we have for industrial decarbonization? You have them on those blue boxes on the top. It's a complex emissions because it's not only from the fuel, also come from the processes that are already highly integrated. Most of them, they have high temperature demands. We of course also have to work with plants that have long lifetimes. Most of these plants, they produce low cost commodity products. So again, going back to this policy driving CO2 emissions reductions. And also we are competing in global markets. And so we need to consider all these challenges. Opportunities, as it has been already mentioned before, they are huge for the whole area of biomass and biotechnology. But one thing I want to make the point here is that the total scale of these contributions and the pace again with these contributions, the opportunity is what we need to work together to make sure that we define it and we realize the potential of all these technologies. Going from the left-hand side, opportunities are in the area of heat, in the area of replacement of materials, in the area of fuels, but all these will have to be realized quickly within the next 2020s to 2030 years. And if you look on the right-hand side, for instance, taking the energy white paper that was published on the back end of last year, again, for instance, the role of BECCS also has to be quantified, and we need to make sure that we develop that full potential of biotechnology. And of course, there are issues, and this is something that may have already been discussed before, and we need to consider around potential availability and sustainability that is going to be key in terms of making sure that we do reach net zero. Next slide, please. Thank you. So if we look at the industrial clusters mission, that's where the focus of our work is. Some of you may already be familiar. This is part of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. The whole program is 170 million. And in addition, it will be matched by 260 million. The graph that you have for the map on the right-hand side indicates those 6 largest clusters, the largest emitters of CO2. You can see they go all the way from Scotland, Grangemouth, Teesside, Humber, Southampton, South Wales, and the Merseyside area. Well, the program here is actually divided into 3 strands, as you have them there. The first strand is demonstrators and shared infrastructure, and the value is 132 million. It's the second element of roadmaps, cluster plans, value of 8 million, and is the Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, IDRIC, that is of the value of 20 million. The thing that really makes me excited is I think this is one of the very few opportunities in the UK, and I would dare to say globally, where we actually are looking at infrastructure deployment, we are looking at roadmaps and a research and innovation center working hand in hand. And this is really going to make a difference when it comes to collaboration. Maybe I should add as well that the element 2 that you have listed in there is already phase 2 is in progress, and the demonstrators and the research and innovation center, IDRIC, they're actually to be confirmed as we move into phase 2. What is the ambition here? Because this is a mission program. So the ambition that we have here was actually RISE as a result of the energy white paper. And what we are aiming here is to deliver 4 low carbon clusters by 2030. That's not far at all. And that's why I said the 2020s are key. And at least 1 net zero cluster by 2040. Next slide, please. So there are 3 particular key elements that we want to help to realize within IDRIC to decarbonize or accelerate the decarbonization of industrial clusters. We need to have these collaborations at the scale and pace. I've already said that before several times, and we heard that from the previous speakers. We also need to have these solutions that integrate as a systems level approach, technology, policy, and business model. And they do that at the right scale. We are looking to do this at the cluster scale, and this has not been achieved before. And the skills are going to be critical. I don't think we have talked yet about the skills, but really the need for the skills, the need for training, retraining is really going to be fundamental for us to achieve net zero. If you look in terms of the 10-point plan, right there, there is 250,000 jobs opportunities into this transition for net zero. Next slide, please. So if we look in terms of the IDRIC, what is our convening power? What is the partnership that we are bringing together? So throughout 2020, we actually engaged 142 partners spread all over the UK, and actually some of our partners are also international corporations. And together they actually have made a pledge also bringing £10 million additional match support to help these clusters to decarbonize. You can see the breakdown there. They go from research organizations, industry associations, NGOs, policymakers, and government bodies. And it's really this unique bringing together this research and innovation landscape with policy and business models that give us a very step ahead in terms of being successful in achieving the mission goals. And moving to the last slide, please. Thank you. So we've been talking about we need to deploy these technologies. We need the innovation, as Terry mentioned as well. And I think here there are a couple of areas where IDRIC is going to be playing a key role. If you want to talk about technology readiness levels, as you have them there, but without going into details, really what we have to do, looking into the left-hand side, we need to make sure that we enable what is going to be a next wave of technologies, and also that we speed the deployment of the current technologies. In some cases, they need to be maybe a little bit demonstrated or maybe just deploy at the scale. Working with funders, with industry, with innovation and tech transfer, with a wide range of really universities and research centers as well across the UK and internationally. And if you look at the right-hand side there, what is going to be really critical is that we evidence share and we cross-learning and stimulate that cross-learning that is going to happen from these deployment projects, that we address the wider issues. Or in other words, that we help with this technology diffusion that is going to come out from the demonstrators and the cluster roadmaps. And that's all I wanted to share. If we just kind of, I think the next slide is just to say thank you. Thanks again for the opportunity. It's been really a pleasure following on the steps of Lord Deben and Terry. And thanks very much, Jen, again. So over to you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Great end to 3 very thought-provoking talks. So now we've got a chance for some questions to the panel, and there's a few being posed in the questions box. So I think the first one, climate change is a global challenge, and whilst it's good to see the ambition and commitment from the UK, how do we ensure that we can have global agreement so that it's not futile, the efforts that we're doing here? And maybe if Lord Deben, if you wanted to just respond on that one.
Well, that's the whole point about the COP26. I mean, we got international agreement in Paris. Every nation now has produced its contribution. We in Britain have set our reduction by 2030 at a very high level, and it's the right level proposed by the Climate Change Committee, accepted by the government. And what this whole COP is about is getting others to raise their sights. And thank goodness, quite a lot of them are now signing up to, I mean, most of the industrialized world is now signed up to reducing their emissions to net zero by 2050. As I said, China is putting it off until 2060, but we hope that they will begin to move in our direction. The fact is, the world is signed up to it. What we have to do is to make sure that we all meet the demands that we have given. And if I may say so, that's the whole issue that is being discussed now about giving planning permission to a new coal mine. that, frankly, we have to make sure that we deliver on what our promises are. And this is a big issue, therefore, and will be an issue for all countries in the world as they try to fulfill their promises.
Great, thank you. And Mercedes, you talked about technologies that are required. So how can we ensure that there's a free flow of technologies and science kind of worldwide?
Well, that is part of our duty. We've caused this whole problem, us, the industrialized nations, and Britain in particular. And if I may dare say, Scotland, even more than the rest of Britain, has actually, because of the brilliance of Scottish engineers and the like, that's the reason that we led in the Industrial Revolution. And much of the climate change that's happening now is the result of what we were doing 150 years ago. That's really what has happened. And so we have a particular responsibility to solve the problem. And that's why we are a leader in the help to developing countries in particular, to be able to use new technology in order to jump the dirty period in which we were damaging the planet to a new world in which we can get growth and give people decent lives, but do so not at that cost. And Britain needs to lead in that way. But as you're quite right, we need also to enable people to have access to our technologies and make a much freer flow between countries. That's one of the reasons why it was such a terrible mistake to leave the European Union, because at least in those circumstances, we had at least that flow. But we're going to have to find alternatives to ensure that there aren't bureaucratic reasons why the remarkable achievements of scientists and technology in this country and other leaders aren't shared around the world.
Great, thank you. Mercedes, did you want to come in there?
Yes, if I may add to what has been said already, I think here is where the role of research and innovation centers and the convening power of actually bringing all this great science and technology that is happening, but also align that with industry as well, align that with government targets, with policy, with business models. I think that's really going to be critical. And I think going back a little bit to one of the points I tried to do in my presentation, it is important that we share the knowledge, the evidence that is going to be gathered as some of these projects, large scale projects, are being deployed and developed in the UK, that we stimulate that cross-learning that will happen coming out of these projects. And also I think this will help us to get that technology diffusion across the UK and overseas. Ultimately, I think what we need to consider as well, building on all the fantastic achievements of our science and technology in the UK, that this is really an opportunity for inward investment as well into these regions of industrial clusters. And I think we need to consider that as well within the big picture. Thank you.
Thanks. So a question for yourself, Terry. Do our Environment Protection Acts really have the potential to revolutionise the climatic scenario?
Not if you implement them in a pedestrian way, which is why I talked about regulators need to be, we need to reinvent the way we regulate. So if I take a very simple example, we do have some businesses who come to us and say, we would like to do something quite innovative in redesigning our production processes, and therefore, for example, say another question in the chat room is, what is dematerialization? So in the food and drink sector, we have businesses here in Scotland who are looking at how do you lightweight bottles or even use very different types of material to put drink in. Now, as a regulator, we can just sit there and say, well, that's got nothing to do with us. But there are things we can do which we don't do anything beyond the law, what we can do, but the law tells us what we need to do. It doesn't stop us doing things on a voluntary basis. So some of those businesses will say, when we're reconfiguring our production processes, it won't affect the emissions or discharges we have under a SEPA license or permit. What we need to do is be very quick about giving them confidence that those decisions we make to vary their permits or licenses happen. Because businesses, the more you innovate, the more risk you're taking. Innovation and risk go together. So what a regulator can do, if it's careful and really has some courage, is help de-risk innovation. So there's all sorts of things you can do. There is potential in the acts that we administer to support innovation, but there's also just potential in the way we operate, the way we think, the way we partner. I'm not saying anything beyond what the law allows us to do, but in being courageous and thoughtful in the way we do things.
Thank you. I know, Lord Deben, you have to leave in a few minutes, so just a question for you before you go. So do you think that the 2045 goal that you mentioned is achievable? Is it really realistic just because it's the law?
Oh, it's certainly realistic. I mean, the Climate Change Committee wouldn't have worked with the Scottish Government to fix this date if it weren't that we've done a very great deal of work showing how it can be done. The great strength of our system in the United Kingdom is, first of all, that the Climate Change Committee is entirely independent and expert rather than being a kind of political body. And secondly, that it works quite separately with the United Kingdom government and with the Scottish government. And we have a separate arrangement with the Scottish government. And therefore, we have worked directly with the Scottish Parliament and with the Scottish ministers to make sure that what is being asked of them and what they have readily taken on board and which they have created and framed is not only possible, but really can be achieved as long as we keep down to it. And I have absolutely no doubt that that is the case. And it is the quality of the work that has been done by our specialists in the Climate Change Committee that gives confidence to Scottish people that this is not pie in the sky. This is not some figure seized out of the atmosphere. It is the result of very, very serious work by economists as well as by scientists. And the problem is simply that we have to get on with it. And Scotland is setting an example to the rest of the United Kingdom by the quality of the work and the speed with which it's moving on. I'm afraid I spend a great deal of my time reminding people in England and in the north of Ireland that they really have got to catch up with the Scots. The Welsh are also doing remarkable things, particularly on waste, as a matter of fact. But I do congratulate the Scots in the work that they've done, and I have no doubt at all in saying that they will achieve. It's not only achievable, but I believe they will achieve the net zero by 2045.
Thank you. So moving on from that, we've got a question here. Scotland has led the way in the UK in pushing and supporting the development of sustainable technologies in the IB sector. So what can the rest of the UK and even globally learn from the Scottish Government, kind of both what's been very positive and also what's been less effective? So I don't know who'd like to answer that one. Terry or Mercedes?
I mean, I've regulated in Australia. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm not Scottish. When I say I'm from down south, I really mean it. And I ran the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, and there's strengths wherever you work. I mean, in Australia, there's quite rightly a lot of criticism for the national approach, but actually there's a huge amount of innovation at the state level, community level, and business level. What's impressed me in coming to Scotland as I contrast those jurisdictions is there is a cliche about Scotland is big enough to be serious, but small enough to be nimble. And that's certainly true. And that is something that I see harnessed quite well. I think the other thing is about setting targets. So targets are very good, particularly if they're set in the way that they've been set here, where you set a number and a timeline, because that gives people some certainty and confidence about we're going for X by date Y, and then it allows people to innovate in their own field. So I find as a regulator, there's the right sort of level of ambition, it's codified in the right way, and then people are given support to get on with it. I think that's the key overall lesson.
Mercedes?
Yes, if I can add to what Terry said, I think it's maybe the other thing that is quite ingrained into the DNA in Scotland. I think it's about collaboration. And I think maybe because reflects on what Terry said, not being too big and not being too small either, and just maybe just giving that right size. where actually you get to know very quickly the whole ecosystem where you are operating, and really the spirit of collaboration and wanting to make a difference. I think that's something is particularly important. And going back also to something that Terry was saying about engaging in early conversations, I think that's something that is also very good in terms of not coming with an idea one that has gone too far down the line, but actually those early conversations that happen very easily, maybe because, as you said, Terry, it could be because it's just the right size, is maybe just easy to get access to the regulators, to government bodies, and really getting into that from the very beginning, from the outset. And in my experience, that's always been really productive and useful, rather than having a conversation when you've gone too far down a certain path and you wish you have discussed earlier. One of the things that we did with IDRIC last year is actually talk with the regulators and SEPA, of course, as well as the regulators from the other devolved administrations. And it was, again, the same, very clear. It's really those early conversations and engagement, and that collaboration that has to happen and has to really crystallize very early.
Great. So that leads into another question we've got here. Could the regulators and the government play a key role in convening private investors to be less risk averse? So this person said their company has a disruptive technology for optimizing upstream fermentation, but we've come across huge barriers when approaching venture capitalists and trying to convince them to invest in these new approaches to biomanufacturing. So how can the regulators and government help us become less risk averse?
Do you want me? I guess I probably should have a go at that, Mercedes. You might.
It says regulators, but I'm happy to pitch after you, Terry. If you want, I can just take the first one, and if that gives you time to think, I'm happy either way. Okay. I think one of the things when it comes around de-risking, I think that's obviously investors want to de-risk their investments. I think one of the things we need to look, and is happening within industrial decarbonization, is some of the business models that are going to be published around CCUS, around hydrogen, and how really those business models, hopefully, they will also incentivize some of the investment. I think ultimately we are going to need all the investment coming from the public and the private sectors. And I don't think we can expect that this transition to net zero is only going to be funded through public investment. We do need to harness those private investments. But going back to something I said before, we need to make sure that we engage in those discussions earlier on, and we understand what are the challenges that they find in terms of their risking. I was told not too long ago that all the investors, they want to be first on being second. And actually that's quite true, because once you are second, that technology or that investment has been the risk. And how do we facilitate that path in terms of being the first and being second? I think that's where research and innovation, working together with regulators, with the government, can actually help to craft that policy and those business models.
Yeah, so I think the key thing is, Mercedes, and you mentioned it then, you mentioned it in one of your earlier answers, is the early engagement. So if I give an example, as Scotland's lead flood authority, the local councils do the lead work on response, but we do the warnings, forecast, the strategy. So we have all this flooding expertise that the public purse is paid for. Now in the planning process, traditionally what we do is we wait for, might be a developer, to develop an idea about how to build, say, along the Clyde, which is largely a floodplain. And then they come to Glasgow City Council, for example, and then we have experts who sit and comment on the planning application. And we say, we don't think you should do this, or we think you should, or we think you should vary it. What we're trying to do is turn it around and get our experts in the room at the start. Why don't we sit down with the developers and the council and the communities and say, well, we can tell you what the flood risk is. What would be a good idea to build here? For one simple example, I don't know if anyone's going to propose this, but I've seen the vertical farm example in Dundee. You could take parts of floodplains in a city and you can build a vertical farm. You don't have to start on the ground floor. You can start on the first floor up and use the area under, if you construct it properly, as a bit of a flood basin. Now I don't know if anyone's proposing that, but I'm just trying to give an example of, I know the problem behind the question. You can't get people to take a risk. I mean, the title of my talk was business as unusual. So we can't do business as usual in this decade at all, really. Everything has to be business as unusual, but you don't need courage to do business as usual. You need courage to do business as unusual. So the earlier you can talk to us and government about what are the set of risks for the people who have to take the step that you talked about, Mercedes. How can we get more people to take the first step? The early engagement is the key, because then we can understand what are the risks and barriers and collectively try and solve them or make them easier to overcome.
Great, thank you. So it's probably just time for one last question, and someone's just put an interesting one in the chat around, are there any projected numbers of potential jobs in Scotland that could be created through all the great work that's going on in this area?
So I don't know if you've heard any, Mercedes, but I'm actually a trained economist, which means I'm professionally trained in just making numbers up.
Go ahead then, please, Terry.
I have heard people talk about lots. And I think it's also, so if you take the Grangemouth complex, which is a high carbon complex, and the government and the businesses there and Falkirk Council have an ambition for a just transition. So it's not just what jobs we create, but we have a reasonably high carbon complex there. We have technologies there. We have people with technical expertise. We can either lose that because high carbon businesses won't exist at some point in the not too distant future, or we can turn that into a low carbon hub using the technology, the technical expertise that exists there. So it isn't just the jobs we can create, it's how do we not lose jobs that will just naturally happen unless we try and be innovative and work in collaboration and partnership. But I can't put a specific number of it despite my training as an economist.
I think, I mean, Terry, again, I completely agree. This is not only job creation, it's job protection as well. So we need to understand, and I think within that process and that journey that we are going to go through, there are going to be some jobs that they're going to be lost and new jobs that they're going to be created, and then it's going to be the job retention. I was looking at, there are some numbers actually coming from Europe that I was looking at before, and actually when they look in terms of the transition Europe, what they were looking at that actually, that overall there will be 5 million jobs that they will actually be added because of this transition. But that came up actually through an addition and subtraction of jobs, new jobs and jobs lost. But the overall, the really positive message is that there was overall, it was a 5 million jobs increase. And I think the other opportunity that we need to look here is the retraining, and that transition Europe estimated that there will be around 18 million jobs, so 18 million people that will need to be retrained in terms of this transition to net zero. So I think we need to look at this in terms of there are going to be challenges, but I think as Terry pointed out as well, I think there are more opportunities ahead of us as well. We just need to make sure that we work together so we realize those opportunities.
Great, thank you. So we've heard some great thoughts on how biotechnology can help address climate challenges. There's an urgency and scale of change that's needed, which means that business as usual is inadequate. So the decarbonisation of industrial clusters is of critical importance to reach net zero and requires multiple technologies and supporting policies. And we need all sectors to change, enforcing a system-wide approach across the technologies, policy and regulators. And collaboration is key. So I'd like to thank the presenters for their time this morning. The next session is on pivoting industrial biotechnology expertise in impact health to impact health, and that's been chaired by Ian Fothering of Ingenza. Before that, there'll be some of the IBioIC's PhD students videos, and that's during a comfort break for around 15 minutes, and the conference will return at around 11:30. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining this morning.
Bio-based manufacturing in small scale. Biocatalyst products market value was £9.9 billion in 2019 and is predicted to grow with a compound annual growth rate of 7% in order to reach 163 kilotons produced by 2027. How important are feedstocks? Feedstock type has a direct impact on the product quality. The main three factors for consideration are feedstock availability, quality consistency, and cost efficiency. There are various feedstock types such as higher animals, streptomyces, yeast, bacteria, and fungi. Fungi cover 60% of the enzyme production. The economic factors with the highest impact are the facility requirements and the raw materials and feedstock. The remaining factors only account for 24% of the total financial expenditure. The scale of the manufacturing facilities require a good titer that is about 10 grams per liter. This is because in most cases during the heavy purification, most of the product will be lost. Accordingly, multiple runs in the fermenters will be needed to achieve the output of 10 to 1,000 of tons per year. Fermenter differ in sizes, and of course the bigger the fermenter, the less runs are needed to achieve desirable output. What are the new technologies on the horizon? Pharmaceutical industry is investigating new modalities that bridge the gap between the two traditional classes of pharmaceutical compounds, small molecules and biologics. New modalities include novel ways to synthesize complex molecules, and for example, enzymes could be more appropriate catalysts for the synthesis of these modalities. In the future, there could be a need for greater speed and agility when developing new medicines. Also, there could be the chance to identify new emerging synthetic methods and improve the speed of enzymatic evolution, as the question remains, when is their activity sufficient for compound synthesis?
The global biosurfactant market was estimated at $4.5 billion in 2020. It is estimated to increase to $6.5 billion by 2027. The biosurfactant market is very concentrated, with the top 5 producers accounting for almost 90% of the total market. Approximately 5,000 tons of biosurfactants are produced per annum. This is relatively low, as biosurfactants are likely to be a niche product due to the limited cost competitiveness compared to chemical surfactants.
The industrial scale production of biosurfactants faces many challenges. Several examples are low yield, foam production during fermentation, and the high cost of downstream processing steps. Optimized fermentation strategies such as fed batch, continuous, and solid-state fermentation, paired with advances in downstream processing, have made industrial scales of production possible.
Potential feedstock for biosurfactant production includes oils such as olive oil, mill effluent, and vegetable oils. You can also use agricultural-based waste such as animal waste or agro-industrial residue. One promising feedstock is glycerol. Glycerol is produced in high volumes as a byproduct in biodiesel production. It's also a very cheap feedstock, with crude glycerol costing 4 to 30 cents per kilogram. Although cheap, it doesn't produce as much biosurfactant compared to other bio options. One problem with the feedstock is that it has to be appropriate for the microbial organism that is used to produce the biosurfactant. This limits the use of some feedstocks as they are not compatible with the downstream processing procedures.
The two most common groups of biosurfactant are rhamnolipids and sulforolipids, made by linking 1 or 2 sugar molecules with a fatty acid. This is a process carried out naturally by a large range of microorganisms. Rhamnolipids and sulforolipids differ in their qualities as biosurfactants, which gives each a unique selling point when looking to fill a gap in the market. Sulforolipids are produced by a yeast, which can achieve much higher yields than the bacteria that produces rhamnolipids. This is an important consideration when looking to optimize the economics of a bioprocess and achieve a comparable and competitive selling price.
Despite the high yields of biosurfactant products obtained from microbial expression systems, the main factor that drives the price of biosurfactants are downstream processing, which accounts for 60% of the production costs. Current biosurfactant recovery methods have some disadvantages, including the higher costs of solvent usage and prolonged processing time, generation of large quantity of spent solvents as toxic waste and their disposal burden, extraction efficiency of solvents and product loss during the process, and requirement of additional purification of crude biosurfactants for specific application that require high purity biosurfactants. Therefore, the need for new eco-friendly and cost-effective downstream processing is required for efficient recovery of biosurfactants.